The story of American movies is the story of America and maybe even the world. In his new book, 10 Movies at a Time, film historian John DiLeo takes us on a 350-film journey through Hollywood and America from 1930 to 1970. John is my guest today, and I hope you'll stay with us as we whirl through part of the 20th century and explore how events affected the movies that were made and how those movies mirrored back the standards, conflicts, chaos, and evolving sensibility of generations of moviegoers. I think we'll also learn that, along with entertaining, movies have been used to influence, instruct, educate, and provoke viewing audiences. They're also a pretty interesting roadmap of amazing technological advances. Remember, the first films were silent and in black and white. I'm Alice Bloom. This is A Town in Village 2. Welcome back. John, thanks so much for being here. I really loved this book. It was like, as I said, or you call it a journey, but it's a historical reference. It isn't just a story of great movies and not so great movies, but movies that tell a story. But one question that arose, why did Hollywood become the seat of movie making? There's so much going on all over the world, but Hollywood became the center of it. I mean, I know later on other things, other places.
I guess there's two reasons. Well, geographically, because of the sort of the great weather and the wide open spaces. So it was a kind of a playground. And, you know, so much of it had been done on the East Coast where you could find the, you know, locations, of course, but in terms of building, like the studios or building, you know, sets for Intolerance and the Ten Commandments and that kind of thing, it was that mix of sort of uncharted, pure land, plus, like I said, this incredible weather that never seemed to get in the way of anything. And so it was sort of built up from zero.
Right, because we're talking about the early part of the 20th century.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then in terms of why did it sort of take over the world, I guess it would be that no other place sort of captured the world's imagination as quickly as the movies coming out of Hollywood. And I guess it would also be the star system that happened real fast. So if you've got people like Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford, who were every day becoming more and more beloved at every sort of little pocket on the globe, you know, then that's where people got to know Hollywood as the place where that all happened. So,
and you know, it's interesting you talk about them being well known around the world. This is before the internet, before YouTube. People had to go to a movie theater.
And well, sometimes they would say, you know, in sort of remote places, there'd be a, you know, just a projectionist, a projector, and, you know, a white sheet to show the movie on, and it could be that primitive. But of course, there was no sound yet, so that was actually a bonus at the beginning, that you could show things anywhere because you could understand everything. If you needed the subtitles, you could translate them to another language. Or you could do things like, certainly most of the slapstick comedies don't need anything. And so it was a way to communicate very quickly and pretty much reach everybody without too much trouble.
Now, movies started out as silent films. When did the talkies start?
Well, the official kickoff is The Jazz Singer, which is 1927, and it's a partial talkie. It's so sort of most of it is a silent movie, but it was the first time most of the audience had seen these sequences, particularly musical numbers in which Al Jolson actually sings. And people didn't know which way it was going to go, and of course people loved it. And so it took about 2 years, though. Really, 1929 is the year that it's pretty much the last of it. Greta Garbo was, of the stars of the 20s, she was the last one to give it a try in 1930, and she was a success, as we know.
You mean as a
talking star.
Okay.
So in 1929, she made several movies, and they're all silent. So it was a 2-year transition period of still like, do we do a talkie version and a silent version, or, you know, where is it going?
Well,
and then it was obvious.
Were people really excited for a talkie movie? I mean,
yeah, I think once the audience got hold of it, it was over.
No going back.
The problem was is that silent movies had gotten so sophisticated visually. So some will say that 1928 is the greatest year in the history of cinema because what they could do in visual storytelling was so remarkable in the few decades that there'd been film. And now they had to basically start from zero again, meaning everyone was afraid to walk away from a microphone. So the scenes would be just like you and me right now with the boom coming down and everyone terrified of making a move, which was so brilliantly satirized in Singing in the Rain in the 50s. But it took a while to catch up to where they had left off.
Okay.
And then, but by the middle of the 1930s, they're pretty much back. But there was that shaky period.
Now, who were the stars who made it successfully from silent films to talkies?
Well, that goes right to the book, because the first chapter in the book is about the transition to sound, because I start in 1930. And I thought, well, the book has to start with that phenomenon. So how do you do it? And I thought, well, why don't I do it through one person, through the prism of one career that did it? And I used Joan Crawford, and she's an interesting one because she became a silent star after The Jazz Singer came out. So talkies already exist, and she'd been in silent movies for a few years, but she becomes a star in 28, doing the Charleston and Our Dancing Daughters. So using her, you see someone who kind of sails into the talkies and becomes bigger than ever, and she's one of the biggest box office attractions of the early 1930s. So she's a great example of a success story, but she also had the advantage of not being too attached to the silence because she had just become a star. People like her and Gary Cooper were late-breaking silent stars, so they had it a bit easier. They weren't as well defined. Some of the other ones who gave up were, people with thick accents who had never really even learned English. Now, Garbo is an exception because she did have a thick accent, but people liked it, and it kind of went with the kind of role she played. It suited her. Some people just didn't even try, and they got on a boat to wherever they came from and were never seen again. And other people, they always said their voice didn't match the image of what people would have imagined would come out of that person. And, it's very hard to pinpoint why and why not,
Sure. Now, talkies were just the beginning of things like horror films. Weren't the first horror films talkie?
Well, no, because you've got Lon Chaney as the Man of a Thousand Faces. But again, it's all without scary voices. It's because it's all silent. There's makeup, and but of course, in the early 30s, it's the age of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, who both become huge right at the beginning, 1931.
Right, so at the beginning of that. And then, of course, came the musicals, which couldn't have happened without sound.
Right. So that's one of the most noticeable things to happen in the talkies, and I think that's my third or fourth chapter, is the creation of this new genre, the movie musical. I just said Joan Crawford became a star dancing in a silent movie, but you could dance in a silent movie. You couldn't sing. You couldn't sing. But what's interesting and what I do in the book is, well, as you know, each chapter deals with 10 movies that are connected in some way. Give you 10 early musicals from 1930 to 1933. And what a lot of people don't remember is the first major musical is the Broadway Melody in 1929. It's a smash hit. It wins the second Oscar for Best Picture. And people are making musicals fast and furiously. And the audience is loving them, and then they're hating them because they're making too many. And so I give you 10 from that period of, this incredible rise and this super fast decline. And by 32, as 33 is about to start, it looks like no one will ever make another musical, which is hard to believe, because any minute now Fred Astaire arrives and it's going to change, and 42nd Street will open, and then they have this golden age of 25 years of glory. But most of them are pretty rickety, creaky, those early ones, because they can't move too far. So, Busby Berkeley doesn't really get going till 33 with 42nd Street and thinking of the things you could do with a camera.
Exactly. I think of the aerial shots.
Because most of the early musicals are backstage musicals, and they pretty much treat the camera like someone sitting in the audience at the show. And then Busby Berkeley thought, well, what's the point of doing movies if you can't just pretend it's not a theater and let anything happen on the stage as long as you come back to the curtain call? And you thought, well, people go for that? And they did, of course. And we loved watching them. They're insane, but they're brilliant.
They're insane, but they're entertaining for sure.
And they're so imaginative. And then now we're into the Depression, and then they're even, more than that. They're pure escapism. Right. Really otherworldly.
Why do you think it took so long to get back to it? I mean, last year we saw La La Land as a contender for an Oscar.
That's another chapter in the book, as
Right.
you know. The end of the original Hollywood musical is one of the chapters from the 1950s. It's the end of the Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly era in the late 50s. So I give you 10 original movie musicals written for Hollywood from 55 to 57. And then comes Gigi, and then it's kind of over. The only musicals we get pretty much from there after is all those Broadway musicals adapted for the screen. They're tried and
My Fair
true.
Lady,
They're not
Sound
risky
of
projects.
Music,
The
right.
audience comes in knowing the songs. You get big stars and dub them. They tried to take all the risk out of it, and it worked for a while. Like you said, My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, West Side Story, these are big hits. I mean, I have a chapter on those as well, and some of them I think some would say I was a little hard on because
We love them anyway.
yeah, we love them anyway, but I might be, some people say, wow, you're really opinionated on those 60s musicals. But getting back to what happened in the 50s was suddenly with rock and roll, pop music was no longer the Great American Songbook. And that was pretty much the Hollywood musical tied to the Broadway musical. They were giving America its hits. The same composers were writing for them back and forth, where it was Cole Porter and Irving Berlin. And suddenly, that's not the pop music of the day. And of course, the other issue is television. Now you've got the competition, not only of television in general, but television variety shows. So
this
does
is
the
the
audience,
50s.
This is the 50s. Does the audience really want to see another Gene Kelly musical if they can stay home and watch the Perry Como show or the Dinah Shore show and see people sing and dance? So that was another reason. So the studios unloaded all their contract players. So people like Jane Powell, Howard Keel, they're out of a job, and there's no more factory on these Hollywood lots that makes musicals, in which everyone's hired to make new musicals, and then it was just didn't
The
exist.
musicals were over. So when television came in, there's lots more to talk about that we'll fill in the gaps, but since we're here, when television came in and it killed the musical movies, what did the movies invent to compel audiences to go to the theater?
Well, of course, I deal with television in the book, and the most obvious answers are things like the widescreen, you know, CinemaScope, VistaVision, Todd AO, filming things on location, 3D, of course, and sort of tricks like that you could come up with. That one didn't last at the time. The one I write about in the book, though, is one I think people forget was remaking classics of the 30s. It was sort of like the previous generation loved these movies. Maybe we can get them to come back and drag their kids, and the kids will fall for them too. So we're going to remake everything. Showboat, A Star is Born, Love Affair, which became An Affair to Remember. The Women, It Happened One Night. I mean, some of them turned out, you know, great and popular, and some of them were terrible, and no one even remembers that they remade My Man Godfrey because it was so awful and it flopped. But ones like Magnificent Obsession were very popular, things like that. And again, that was another way of audiences responded to this material, and they will again. So, you know, anything about the tried and true, like I talked about the musicals of the 60s, do they know it already? Name recognition, that desperation, because television was the greatest threat ever to hit the movies. And even when you could say the internet and what, nothing can compare with that threat of, oh my goodness, they can stay home and it's free.
Well, they had to buy a television set.
After that, no,
Because
then it's right.
not every, I mean, that was pretty expensive
Right,
for an average
right.
family at the time.
And then I have a chapter in the 60s section of the book on the end of black and white, which again, we can go to television. Now, not only does everyone have a television, everyone has a color television.
Well, but that took a few years.
The late 60s. The late 60s.
But TVs came in the early, mid-50s.
No, I'm saying now I jumped to
Yeah,
the end of black and white
right.
because all those black and white TV shows went to color, and now you can't stay. If you could stay home and watch something in color for free, are you going to go out and let's see that new black and white movie? And Hollywood decided no, they wouldn't.
But yet, it's interesting that you say that because we were still watching that. Even when it became color, it was usually it's on a little screen. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody had the 55,
Right,
60-inch
right,
TVs that
right,
people
right.
have in their homes
Right,
today.
right.
There was a small screen.
Well, that's why movies were selling, you know, widescreen. They were selling CinemaScope. They were selling Cinerama. You're going to see how the West was won in 3 panels, you know.
So you went to the movies for an adventure, an experience that you couldn't have at home. I'd love to hear your comments on the state of movies today, where, let's face it, we've got small screens, big screens, screens anytime you want,
Right.
DVRs. I mean,
Right.
why leave your house ever?
Right, and things become available so quickly after they've played in the theater too. You don't really have to wait very long. If you're a patient person, you never have to go to the movies again.
Or the made for TV movies.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting because we used to have made for TV on television.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Hallmark Hall of
Right.
Fame it comes to mind immediately. But now you've got Netflix and
Right, so
Amazon
they're
and
opening on the same day in a theater or to
or
stream.
right, you
Yeah.
could watch it at home.
Yeah, it's always changing, and you always
pretty
have to try to be
disruptive.
on top of what is the thing that people will spend their money on. You know?
I digress, because we have so much to talk about. I do want to talk about the impact on movies of world events. And you explore this in great depth in the book. World War I, for example. All right, World War ends right when movies are starting to come in. What kind of movies reflected sentiments about the war?
Well, what's interesting, I do have a chapter on World War I, but of course, I start in 1930. The chapter is about movies of the early 30s that deal with World War I. And of course, well, most of them are anti-war, and it's peacetime. So it's always a thriving time for anti-war movies when there's no war.
And it took 10 years.
There were some great silent films that did deal with it, like The Big Parade with John Gilbert. That's sort of like the Gone with the Wind of the silent era. But what's interesting about the ones from the early 30s, because it merges with the Depression too, is so many are about the forgotten man, movies about veterans that have nothing 15 years later, and now there's no economy. You know, it's a great one is I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. I mean, he's treated mercilessly by the world, by his country, and he's a decorated war hero. And these movies deal with sometimes drug addiction is one of the things that happens to these guys. Some of them are explicitly about the war. Of course, the greatest example, and I included in the book, is All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a combat movie about the innocence of boys who think they're going to some fantastic adventure, who quickly find out, that's not the case. And of course, what's even more fascinating is it's about Germans. It's a movie about the enemy, and it has nothing to do with what the war is about. It's about any innocent young man being sent off to fight. But of course, 10 years later, we're in World War II. It would be an unlikely time to reissue All Quiet on the Western Front. But then, of course, Hollywood, with World War II, realizes its job, the morale-boosting job.
Did Hollywood realize it themselves, or were they encouraged to realize it?
They were encouraged, but they took it on like a duck to water, as we say. They realized their power real fast, and they embraced it wholeheartedly in several different directions of the home front movies, telling the people at home how to behave. Don't do this, do this. Look at Mrs. Miniver in England. If you could do everything like her, I mean, she's the model to try to imitate in your life if the Nazis get here, because nobody knew, of course, when you're watching these movies, how close the war was going to get. But of course, it was that mix of the battle movies. They would do sort of Bataan, Corregidor, things that were in the headlines, and they try to bring it and bring information to the audience. But then there'd be this, also it's the age of Betty Grable, and it's like, if you want to forget the war in every way, come to the movies, because it's like it's not happening.
So they had two roles. One is to entertain and remove you from the horrors that were the world's events.
Right.
And two, to instruct you on how to behave or what you need to know about in the war.
And even most of the ones that they're giving you information, they still kind of softened it. So because the whole thing was also to make sure people believed we were going to win. It was never about, this is looking bad. Never about that. It was like, even if it was something sad, it was always something that left you, we're going to win, America's going to win. And
was that a sentiment that was echoed in the country? I mean, were they told to encourage people to keep their spirits up? Or, I mean...
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so. But Hollywood, I think, is the most obvious example of how that was sort of brandished. How it was, plastered everywhere. Go to the movies, giant screens, and
So when did dystopian sentiment come in? I mean, is that just a much more current experience of existential angst?
Well, after the war, we have a chapter on the Cold War movies, and that, in a way, it just continued the World War II movies. Instead of Nazis, now it was communists, but the sort of villains sort of play the same way in terms of the Hollywood scripts. But again, there was a lot of fear. I mean, the point was to scare you, but always leave you with, but don't worry, we've got this. John Wayne's going to take care of it.
So when did that optimism turn towards negativism?
I don't think it ever won one out over the other, because after the war, World War II, after people find out about the Holocaust and we've dropped the bombs in Japan, there's a sort of a new realism in the movies. We're like, we're grown up now. We're going to bring in anti-Semitism and racism and alcoholism in the movies and deal with these and show people what's going on. And these are not going to be fun movies. Although, again, they always leave you optimistically that this can be, whatever the issue is, it can be overcome. We're on it. Don't worry. But interesting phenomenon at that same moment, and I have another chapter in the book, as you know, on all the fantasy films that came out after World War II, as if to say, if you're really not ready for all this real stuff, and you're one of those people who says, gosh, one thing I don't want to do with the movies is think. I want to just go away. And all these fantasy movies for grown-ups, things like Ghost and Mrs. Muir, it's not really they're not kids' movies. Even Bishop's Wife, it's essentially about a marriage. And Miracle on 34th Street is about a cynical woman finding that sort of childlike place buried inside her. And so it was really a way of saying, don't worry, Hollywood will never let you down. We're trying to keep up. We're trying to reflect what's going on, but we're not going to betray you and the things you love us for, whether it's glamour or optimism or just, pretty, colorful things.
We're going to satisfy you. And yet, the production code came in. 40.
Fascinating thing. When I'm talking about
34, 38.
Depression and what was it, World War I. This is also before the censorship of the Hollywood production code, self-governing, because they were afraid the actual government would come in and tell them what to do. So they're going to do it themselves. They didn't enforce it in the early years, so that's why we have those wonderful, racy, sexy movies of the early 30s, usually starring Jean Harlow or Carole Lombard and sometimes Bette Davis and, of course, Joan Crawford. Wonderful, racy movies that don't seem like old movies because they're often about sex. And I have a chapter on wonderful titles like Faithless and Illicit and Female, and, they're unashamed. But once it comes in, we have the age of the twin beds for married couples era, which lasts almost 30 years. It starts to crumble into the 60s. Even I have a chapter on those bad sex comedies, which are the end of that, like the foreplay to the sexual revolution, the Doris Day era. So Hollywood, you would think, how are they going to master this after having this freedom? Now they're going to be so reined in, but you do what you have to do within the boundaries you're given. And when the censorship comes in, we really have the golden age of Hollywood. So it's kind of ironic.
Well, give us a standard and we'll work around it.
Yeah, we can work around, we can suggest things. We can do awfully sexy things like the kiss in Notorious with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman. They got away with this kiss that goes on forever because they keep separating. So it's a lot of little kisses.
Was allowed.
It's not a long kiss, but it really is. So things like that are still very sexy. They're just more suggestive than explicit.
When did the production code get eliminated?
In the mid to late 60s. It's sort of dismantled slowly, and what we have then is the rating system come in, and that's when we have what we call the new Hollywood, which we're still really in for the last 50 years.
So it's okay, but you just need to know what you're going to see.
Yes, you can pretty much do anything you want as long as you slap it with the right rating.
Now, you cover many genres. One of my favorite is film noir.
Yes.
Okay, so that came in right after the war, I guess.
Yes, it's starting to happen during the war. Double Indemnity's 44, and that's maybe the first masterpiece of film noir. But again, this is something coming out of the war. It's a kind of like another one of those sort of grown-up genres about cynicism and kind of fatalistic attitude. Things don't always work out. It's not really a Hollywood world. It's like all the stuff going on at night.
It's always at night.
A lot of it, when the nice people are asleep.
It's usually raining too.
Yeah, the nice people are asleep, but the people who are up are planning heists and things, and bad girls are trying to get schnooks to do stupid things that they can get them to do. And it really is part of that post-war thing. It's not, they're not issue-oriented, like I said, they're not dealing with alcoholism or mental illness or racism. They're really just dealing with relationships and crime and sex, the basics, the basics, but they hold up really well. I think because that attitude, the attitudes in there are pretty modern in terms of movies. And so I deal with, ones from the 40s that are from that first sort of burst of this kind of thing. They didn't even know what to call it at the time, but...
Now, do we still have a genre of film noir? Is it still being made?
Yes, they still, I mean, they're all in color now, but pretty much. But anytime you see a thriller with a beautiful, crafty female, and if there's a detective and crime and a plot of people around a table with the light low and they're planning something. I mean, it's really never gone away. It's just not as pure in terms of the visual elements, which I think are the most striking thing about the 40s ones.
Now, it's interesting. Black and white's dead, except when it's not.
Right. Right.
And a couple of pretty great filmmakers have used it to their advantage.
But now it's always an event. If someone uses black and white, it's like, oh my God.
Right, I think of Woody Allen.
Woody Allen, of course, Manhattan, of course, Schindler's List, of when George Clooney did the Edward R. Murrow movie, Good Night and Good Luck. But it's an event. And of course, it was always just a viable option up until like 67. You want to use black and white or color. It's cheaper to use black and white. But you know, it's funny. It used to be, if you wanted to do a real New York gritty movie like Sweet Smell of Success or Marty or Love with the Proper Stranger, it was always black and white. And then, of course, once, Scorsese and Mean Streets, that kind of thing, no one would ever think to do, use black and white to just show New York.
But isn't color so much more realistic now? I mean, the original color films were pretty...
Absolutely. Technicolor, in its glory days, Robin Hood or the MGM musicals, it's absolutely gorgeous. But you're right, it doesn't look like life.
It's not real.
It doesn't look like life, which is why it was kind of not as well regarded. Most of the great movies of the Golden Age, whether it's Citizen Kane or, serious movies, are almost all in black and white.
We can't eliminate probably the biggest, most popular genre to our viewing audience, Westerns.
Yeah.
Now, how do they fit into the scenario here? They came in the 50s.
Well, I think the great, for me, I have two chapters on Westerns. One is from the great ones of the 1950s, which to me is the peak era. And I think why, a lot of things just kind of converged. So many of the earlier Westerns are those let's forge a nation kind of movies of Cimarron and things like that. Occasionally there would be a great one like Stagecoach. But most of them are like Union Pacific, Wells Fargo. They're broad canvas things. And then I'll jump ahead after the 50s. As things get more and more realistic, they become very, very bloody because it's accurate. And you have a masterpiece like The Wild Bunch, but it's a different kind of thing because it's dirty, it's filthy, it's bloody, it's painful. But just as you're starting to get into more of that realism, but not too much, and more character-driven stories rather than these big canvassed things, the 50s is where it all happens. And of course, it's very psychologically driven Westerns like High Noon or Shane, The Searchers, The Big Country. There are so many great Westerns from the 1950s. You could never see them all in your life.
And if you go to Monument Valley and you see the John Ford Museum, you start to really appreciate the cinematography and the transportation to another place in time, especially for New Yorkers who don't get to see the West.
And I think the Western is a genre that is so primal. You can do any plot and make it a Western. It's so basic, but any kind of basic story can be translated into a Western format and it works. And so, and the other thing I have in the book is about the Civil War Westerns, because after Gone with the Wind was such a phenomenon, everyone wanted to imitate it, and nobody really did at the time successfully. But one of the interesting offshoots is the Civil War Western, because it's easy to forget that it was not really going on in the West, but the West was a part of it, and how there are all these movies about Northerners or Southerners going out West for the resources or to get people to fight, or towns would be split.
So it's really an education of our culture at the time.
And that's a main point about old movies is how they would always go backward to try to teach people things, and they would to get young people interested. Now everything's too much about the future and fantasy, which
Too much.
Isn't real.
John, I wish we had more time,
I'm sure.
but this has been so great.
Okay.
I mean, it's great. Thanks so much for being my guest. It's always a pleasure.
Same here, Alice. Thank you.
It's great fun. And thank you at home for watching. I'm Alice Bloom. We'll see you next time.